The morning Dorothea Ashmore learned she would marry a duke began like any other, with the sound of rain against the windows of Hartwell House, and the particular silence that meant her family was avoiding her. She had been avoiding them as well, which was why she found herself in the rarely used morning room on the second floor, a book open in her lap that she wasn't really reading. The room smelled of dust and old upholstery, and its windows overlooked the kitchen courtyard rather than the fashionable gardens, which made it perfect for invisibility. She was 23 years old, unmarried, and increasingly aware that she represented a problem her family didn't know how to solve. Her younger sister Vivienne was the beauty, the accomplished one, the daughter who drew suitors like flowers drew bees. Dorothea was sensible, practical, the sort of woman people described with words like capable and steady, when they couldn't think of anything better to say. The voices reached her before she understood what they were saying. Terrible shame, but what's to be done? That was Mrs. Phillips, the housekeeper, her voice carrying up through the servants' stairwell that connected to the morning room's adjoining dressing closet. Poor Miss Dorothea, sent off like a parcel to make up for Miss Vivienne's foolishness. Dorothea froze, her book forgotten. His Grace won't be pleased, that's certain. The second voice belonged to Mary, one of the senior maids, expecting the beautiful Miss Ashmore and getting the plain one instead, like ordering a thoroughbred and receiving a cart horse. Mary, that's unkind. It's true though, isn't it? Miss Vivienne could have been a duchess, but she had to go and fall in love with Lord Pemberton. Now Miss Dorothea has to clean up the mess. The voices faded as the servants moved away, but the words remained, settling into Dorothea's chest like stones. She sat very still, processing what she'd heard in the detached way she processed most unpleasant things, by examining them carefully before allowing herself to feel anything about them. An arranged marriage to a duke in place of Vivienne. It made a horrible kind of sense. Their father had been negotiating some business arrangement for months, traveling to London repeatedly, returning with the satisfied air of a man who had secured advantageous terms. Vivienne had been unusually subdued lately, spending more time than usual staring out windows with the dreamy expression that meant she was thinking about Lord Pemberton. Apparently, Vivienne had decided she would rather marry for love than duty, and apparently, Dorothea would be sent to fulfill the arrangement instead. No one had thought to inform her, of course. Why would they? Plain, sensible Dorothea would do what needed doing. She always did. The official announcement came that evening at dinner. Her father made it sound like an honor, an opportunity, a piece of extraordinary good fortune. The Duke of Ravenscroft required a bride. The Ashmore family would provide one. Contracts had been signed, settlements agreed upon. Everything was arranged. "You'll leave in 3 days," her father said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Mrs. Fletcher will travel with you as chaperone. The Duke expects his bride within the week." "Does he know," Dorothea asked quietly, "that he's getting a different sister than he contracted for?" Her father's face reddened. "He has been informed of the change in circumstances. He has agreed to proceed. The alliance is what matters, not—" He gestured vaguely, unable to finish the sentence. Not which daughter, not whether she was beautiful or accomplished, or any of the things that typically mattered when gentlemen chose wives. Only that she was an Ashmore and therefore acceptable for the transaction. Vivienne didn't come to say goodbye when Dorothea left 3 days later. She sent a note instead, full of apologies and assurances that Dorothea would be perfectly happy as a duchess. The note smelled of rosewater and felt like dismissal. The journey north took 4 days, the landscape gradually changing from the soft hills of Somerset to the wilder, more dramatic terrain of Northumberland. Dorothea watched it all from the carriage window with a strange sense of detachment, as if this were happening to someone else, some other practical daughter being sent to fulfill obligations. Mrs. Fletcher, her chaperone, maintained a respectful silence for most of the journey, which Dorothea appreciated. She didn't want sympathy or advice or reassurance that everything would work out. She wanted to arrive at Ravenscroft Hall with her dignity intact, prepared to be whoever she needed to be. When the estate finally appeared through the late afternoon mist, Dorothea's first thought was that it looked like a place where people went to be forgotten. Stone walls the colour of storm clouds, narrow windows that revealed nothing of what lay within, grounds that stretched away in every direction with the kind of austere beauty that didn't invite comfort. The carriage rolled to a stop. Footmen appeared with practiced efficiency. Dorothea stepped down onto gravel, her travelling dress dusty and wrinkled, her hair escaping its pins after 4 days of jostling, and walked toward the entrance with her spine straight and her face composed. The butler greeted her with the particular blend of deference and assessment that servants perfected. "Miss Ashmore, welcome to Ravenscroft. His Grace is currently inspecting the South Tenant Farms, but is expected to return within the hour. Mrs. Warren, the housekeeper, will show you to your rooms." An hour. Dorothea felt relief and disappointment in equal measure. She wasn't ready to meet the Duke, but delaying only prolonged the anticipation. Mrs. Warren was a woman of middle years with sharp eyes and a manner that suggested she missed nothing. She led Dorothea through corridors that seemed designed to impress rather than welcome, everything dark wood and ancestral portraits, and the kind of formal elegance that made casual comfort impossible. "The Duchess's suite," Mrs. Warren announced, opening a door onto rooms that were larger and more luxurious than anything Dorothea had ever inhabited. "The maid will attend you shortly. Dinner is at 8. His Grace prefers punctuality." After she left, Dorothea stood in the center of the enormous bedroom and tried to imagine living here, sleeping in that massive four-poster bed, dressing in that ornate wardrobe, belonging in space clearly designed for someone far more important than a replacement bride. The maid who came to help her dress was young, nervous, and inclined to chatter. "Ever so exciting, miss. Now having a new Duchess. The house has been quite dull since the late Duchess passed, and that was 5 years ago now. His Grace keeps to himself mostly, manages the estates, and sits in Parliament, but he's fair to the staff, never cruel. Some of the girls thought he'd never marry again after—" She stopped abruptly, as if remembering she was speaking to the woman who would become the next Duchess of Ravenscroft. "After," Dorothea prompted gently. "After the first Duchess died, miss, in childbirth, the baby too. His Grace was, well, everyone says he was devoted to her. Terrible tragedy. So, she was not just replacing her sister. She was replacing a dead woman the Duke had loved." The information settled into Dorothea's stomach like, what must he think of this arrangement? Being forced to marry again, to some woman he'd never met, because duty required heirs even if his heart had been buried 5 years ago. She dressed in her best gown, a deep green silk that was well made, but several seasons out of fashion, and let the maid arrange her hair into something approximating elegance. The mirror showed her what it always did. A woman with regular features, serious grey eyes, dark hair that was neither remarkable nor unfortunate. Not ugly, but not beautiful either. The perpetual middle ground. She made her way to the dining room at precisely 8 o'clock, prepared to meet her future husband and discover what variety of disappointment lived in his eyes when he looked at her. The dining room was magnificent in an oppressive way, ceiling painted with classical scenes, walls hung with tapestries depicting hunting scenes, a table that could seat 40 but was currently set for 2. Candelabras cast flickering light that made shadows dance in corners. The Duke stood with his back to the door, looking out the tall windows at grounds now nearly invisible in the twilight. He was tall, his posture suggesting a man accustomed to command, his dark coat perfectly tailored across shoulders that didn't need padding to seem imposing. He turned when she entered. Edmund Blackwood, Duke of Ravenscroft, was perhaps 35, his dark hair showing the first threads of silver, his face strong-featured rather than handsome. But it was his eyes that captured her attention, dark blue, almost grey, holding an intelligence that felt like assessment and something else she couldn't immediately name. He studied her with a directness that should have been rude but somehow wasn't, taking in her unfashionable dress, her nervous hands, her carefully neutral expression. Dorothea forced herself to hold his gaze, to curtsy with precision, to speak with the calm she'd practiced. "Your Grace, thank you for receiving me. Miss Ashmore." His voice was deeper than she expected, carrying easily in the large room. "I trust your journey was tolerable." "It was adequate." Something shifted in his expression. Amusement, perhaps, or recognition of her deliberate understatement. "Please sit. Travelling 4 days by carriage is rarely merely adequate." He held her chair himself, a gesture of courtesy that surprised her. Most men of his rank would leave such tasks to servants. As she settled into her seat, she caught the faint scent of saddle leather and autumn air, suggesting he'd come directly from the farms with barely enough time to change. The first course appeared, a clear soup that Dorothea had no appetite for but ate anyway. because not eating would be noticed and commented upon. I should address what you must be thinking, the Duke said after the servants had withdrawn. You are wondering if I'm disappointed that you're not your sister. Dorothea's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. The directness surprised her. Are you? No. The single word, delivered without hesitation or elaboration, hung between them. I received a letter from your father explaining the change in circumstances, he continued. Your sister chose to marry Lord Pemberton. I understand he's a decent man, if not particularly wealthy. I assume the attachment was genuine. I believe so, yes. Then I'm glad she followed her heart, rather than honouring an arrangement she didn't want. Marriage is difficult enough when both parties enter willingly. The comment was so unexpected, so contrary to what she'd anticipated, that Dorothea found herself studying his face for signs of irony or mockery. She found neither. That's a remarkably understanding perspective, Your Grace. Is it? I would think it's merely practical. What good is a wife who wishes she were elsewhere? He took a sip of wine, his gaze never leaving her face. But I am curious about one thing. Did you volunteer to take her place? Or did you volunteer? The question cut too close to the truth she'd been trying not to examine. Dorothea set down her spoon, with deliberate care. Does it matter? Perhaps not to your family. It matters to me. She looked at him then, really looked at him, trying to understand what he wanted from this conversation. His expression was open, expectant, genuinely interested in her answer. I was informed 3 days before departure, she said quietly. It was presented as duty. I fulfilled it. Against your wishes? I'm not certain I know what my wishes are, Your Grace. I've spent my life being told what I should want. It becomes difficult to separate obligation from desire. He was silent for a moment, considering this. A frank answer. I appreciate that more than you know. The rest of the dinner passed in conversation that surprised Dorothea with its substance. He asked about her interests, her reading, her opinions on estate management, not the polite surface questions men typically asked women, but genuine inquiries that suggested he actually cared about her answers. When she mentioned she'd been studying agricultural innovations, he didn't dismiss it as unfeminine. Instead, he asked which innovations she found most promising and why. Crop rotation, she said, warming to the topic despite herself. Mr. Townshend's four-field system shows remarkable promise for soil conservation, though I understand many estates resist change because tradition feels safer than innovation. Ravenscroft implemented the four-field system 3 years ago, he said. Yield increased by nearly 20%. Tradition has its place, but so does adaptation. They talked through 3 courses, the conversation ranging from agricultural reform to parliamentary politics to a recent archaeological discovery in Egypt. Dorothea found herself forgetting to be nervous, forgetting to monitor her words for anything that might be considered inappropriate for a lady. It was only when the clock chimed 10 that she realized how long they'd been sitting there, the servants having long since cleared the table and withdrawn. I should retire, she said, though she was reluctant to end the conversation. Thank you for dinner, Your Grace. He stood when she did, inclining his head. The pleasure was mine, Miss Ashmore. Truly. As she walked back to her rooms, Dorothea felt unsettled in a way she couldn't quite name. She had arrived expecting coldness, disappointment, polite endurance of an unwanted obligation. Instead, she'd found intelligence, genuine interest, and something that felt dangerously like respect. It would be so much easier if he'd been what she expected, easier to maintain distance, to protect herself, to accept this marriage as transaction rather than possibility. But he hadn't been what she expected, and that terrified her more than disappointment ever could. The morning after their first dinner, Dorothea woke to sunlight streaming through windows she'd forgotten to curtain. Ravenscroft looked different in daylight, less forbidding, more substantial, the stone walls honey-coloured where the sun touched them. From her window, she could see the grounds stretching away toward distant forests, tenant cottages sending up threads of smoke, fields marked out in neat patterns that suggested careful management. She was still standing there, wrapped in a borrowed dressing gown, when a knock came at her door. The young maid from the previous evening entered with a tea tray and an expression of barely suppressed excitement. "Good morning, miss. His Grace has requested that you join him at the stables at 10 o'clock, if you're amenable. He thought you might like to see the estate." Dorothea's heart did something complicated. The stables? Yes, miss. He said to tell you there's a mare that might suit if you're comfortable riding. She was comfortable, more comfortable than she was with most social activities. At Hartwell House, riding had been her escape, the one place where being sensible and unfashionable didn't matter, because horses didn't care about such things. But riding with the Duke meant proximity, conversation without the formal structure of a dinner table, the possibility of revealing herself in ways she hadn't intended. "Please tell His Grace I would be delighted," she heard herself say. The maid helped her into a riding habit that had been provided. Dark blue wool, beautifully tailored, clearly expensive. It fit almost perfectly, which meant someone had taken her measurements from her travelling clothes and ordered this made in advance. The attention to detail unsettled her. She'd arrived expecting to be an afterthought, but someone, the Duke himself, had anticipated her needs with care that suggested she mattered. The stables at Ravenscroft were larger than most houses, immaculately maintained, smelling of hay and leather and horses. Dorothea breathed it in with something approaching relief. This was familiar ground, a language she spoke fluently. The Duke was already there, standing beside a grey mare whose coat gleamed like polished silver. He'd changed from his formal dinner attire into riding clothes that somehow made him seem more approachable, more human. When he saw Dorothea, something in his expression lightened. "Miss Ashmore, good morning. I hoped you might ride, but I wasn't certain. I'm no great horsewoman, but I'm competent enough." "This is Moonstone," he said, running a hand along the mare's neck with obvious affection. "She was my late wife's favourite, gentle disposition but spirited when given her head. I thought she might suit you." The comment was offered casually, but Dorothea heard the weight beneath it. He was trusting her with something that mattered to him, something connected to the wife he'd lost. It felt like a test, though she wasn't sure what answer would pass it. "She's beautiful," Dorothea said honestly, approaching slowly and offering her hand for the mare to sniff. Moonstone regarded her with intelligent dark eyes, then bumped her nose against Dorothea's palm in what seemed like approval. "She likes you," the Duke observed. "She's particular about riders." Within minutes, they were mounted and riding out across Ravenscroft's grounds. The Duke sat his horse with the easy confidence of a man born to ride, but he kept his gelding's pace matched to Moonstone's, never rushing ahead or making Dorothea feel she had to struggle to keep up. They rode in silence for the first mile, Dorothea acutely aware of him beside her, the way he sat his horse, the occasional glances he sent her way, as if checking that she was comfortable. When they reached a rise that offered a view over the entire valley, he pulled up. "There," he said, gesturing toward the landscape spread below them. "Ravenscroft, 12,000 acres, 16 tenant farms, 3 villages that depend on estate employment. The responsibility of it used to terrify me when I was younger. And now it feels like purpose. These people depend on decisions I make and I steward. That's not a burden. It's a privilege." Dorothea looked out over the vista, fields and forests, cottages and walls, a living tapestry of human endeavour and natural beauty. "You care about it. That's rarer than you might think among landlords. You sound as though you've observed otherwise. My father owns land in Somerset. He views it as investment, not stewardship. The tenants are tolerated, I suppose. Not valued." She paused, surprised by her own frankness. "I'm sorry. That was disloyal. It was honest. I asked you to be honest with me." They rode on, and gradually the conversation flowed more easily. He pointed out improvements he'd made, a new drainage system, expanded cottages, a school he'd built for tenant children. She asked questions about crop yields and rotation schedules, about whether he'd considered trying the new mechanical reapers she'd read about. "You've studied this," he said, and it wasn't a question. "I read a great deal. It's considered an eccentricity in a woman. Intelligence is never an eccentricity. It's simply threatening to those who lack it." They had stopped near a stream, the horses drinking while Dorothea and the Duke stood beneath an ancient oak whose branches formed a canopy overhead. The autumn sun filtered through leaves turning gold and red, and for a moment everything felt suspended, perfect. "May I ask you something?" she said, the words emerging before caution could stop them. "Anything. Why did you agree to the marriage when you learned my sister had refused? You could have withdrawn, found another alliance, another bride." He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze on the stream rather than her. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, thoughtful. Because your father's letter was honest about the substitution. He didn't try to hide it or pretend you were anything other than what you are, Vivienne's younger sister, sent in her place because duty required it. And then he included something he probably shouldn't have. What? A character reference. He said you were too intelligent for your own good, too serious to be popular, too honest to be comfortable in society. He meant it as an apology, I think, warning me that I was getting the difficult daughter instead of the charming one. The Duke smiled faintly. It was the first time in 30 years of negotiating marriages and alliances that I thought I might actually enjoy the woman I'd be living with. Dorothea felt heat rise to her cheeks. That's a low bar, Your Grace. You'd be surprised how rarely it's cleared. Most arranged marriages involve women trained to be decorative and agreeable. I've sat through enough dinners with such women to know I'd rather live alone than spend my life making polite conversation about nothing. So you chose me because I'm not decorative or agreeable. I chose you because you're interesting. Everything else is negotiable. The comment landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through her understanding of herself. She'd spent her life being told that intelligence in women was tolerated at best, actively discouraged at worst. To hear it described as desirable, as a reason for choosing her, it unmade something in her chest. I don't know what to say to that, she admitted. You don't have to say anything. Just don't hide what you are. Don't make yourself smaller to fit expectations that don't matter. They mounted again and rode back toward the house. But something had shifted between them. The silence was no longer awkward, but companionable. And when their horses' paths brought them close together, Dorothea was acutely aware of his proximity in a way that had nothing to do with rank or obligation. Over the following days, a pattern developed. Each morning, they rode out together, exploring different parts of the estate. He showed her the home farm where innovations were tested before being recommended to tenants. She asked questions that made his steward, who sometimes accompanied them, look surprised that a lady would care about such things. In the afternoons, he invited her to his study to review estate accounts. It should have been tedious, but Dorothea found herself fascinated by the economics of managing 12,000 acres, by the careful balance between profit and tenant welfare, by the hundreds of small decisions that added up to prosperity or ruin. You have a mind for this, he said one afternoon, watching her trace columns of figures with a concentration that made her forget to be self-conscious. Have you ever considered that estate management might be your calling? Women don't manage estates, Your Grace. Duchesses do, or they can if they choose. He leaned forward, his expression serious. When we marry, Ravenscroft becomes as much yours as mine. I'm not looking for an ornamental wife who presides over tea and needlework. I'm looking for a partner who can help me make decisions that affect thousands of lives. The casual "when we marry" rather than "if" sent a thrill through her that she tried very hard to suppress. They hadn't discussed the actual wedding, hadn't set a date, had barely acknowledged the reality that this courtship, if that's what it was, would end in binding vows. But he spoke of it as certainty, as something already decided, and Dorothea didn't correct him. The evenings were different. After dinner, they would retire to the library, a warm, book-lined room that felt like the heart of the house, and talk for hours. He asked about her childhood, her education, what had made her the person she was. She asked about his life before her, about his first marriage, about the loss that had shaped him. Caroline was gentle, he said one, staring into the fire, kind to everyone, loved children, would have been a wonderful mother. When she died, he paused, choosing words carefully. I thought I'd never recover from it, and then I did, which felt like betrayal, like I was supposed to stay broken as proof that she'd mattered. But you didn't stay broken, Dorothea said softly. No, I learned to live with the loss. I've earned that grief doesn't mean you stop living, only that you carry something heavy while you do. He looked at her then. I'm telling you this because I don't want you to think you're competing with a ghost. Caroline was my past. You're my future. They're not the same thing. The vulnerability in his admission made Dorothea's throat tight. I'm glad you told me. Are you happy here? He asked suddenly. Or are you just being polite? The question caught her off guard. Was she happy? She'd arrived expecting endurance, prepared to be tolerated. Instead, she'd found intellectual companionship, genuine interest, respect she'd never experienced before. She'd found a man who seemed to see her, really see her, in ways no one ever had. She struggled for honesty. I'm more content than I've ever been, which terrifies me. Because I don't know if I'm allowed to want this. If wanting it makes me foolish, why would wanting happiness make you foolish? Because happiness depends on circumstances beyond my control. Because I could want this and lose it. Because... Saul, she stopped, unable to articulate the deeper fear, that she could open herself to this possibility and discover she'd misunderstood everything, that his interest was kindness rather than genuine attachment. He moved from his chair to sit beside her on the settee, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. Dorothea. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the intimacy of it made her pulse quicken. I'm going to be very clear about something. This isn't an obligation anymore. It stopped being an obligation the first evening we spoke. I want to marry you. Not because contracts were signed, but because I've spent the last 2 weeks discovering that I genuinely enjoy your company. That seems like an excellent foundation for a marriage. You barely know me. I know you're intelligent and honest and brave enough to ask difficult questions. I know you care about things that matter and aren't afraid to have opinions that challenge conventional thinking. I know that when you laugh, which isn't often enough, it's the most genuine sound I've heard in years. He reached for her hand and she let him take it, feeling the warmth of his palm against hers. I know enough to know I want to know everything else. Dorothea looked at their joined hands, at the physical manifestation of connection she'd stopped believing she'd ever feel. What if I'm not brave enough for this? Then we'll be afraid together. But Dorothea, I think you're far braver than you give yourself credit for. That night, lying awake in the enormous ducal bed, Dorothea allowed herself to imagine a future she'd never dared want. Not just marriage as duty fulfilled, but partnership. Not just tolerance, but genuine affection, maybe even love. Though that word still felt too dangerous to speak aloud, she was beginning to let herself hope. Which was, of course, precisely when everything shattered. The letter arrived on a grey morning 2 weeks after Dorothea's arrival at Ravenscroft, delivered by special courier and marked urgent. She was in the estate office with Edmund. She'd stopped thinking of him as the Duke, somewhere around the 10th time he'd asked her opinion on tenant improvements, reviewing plans for a new drainage system when the butler entered with the silver salver. For Miss Ashmore, Your Grace. I am from Somerset. The courier was instructed to await a reply. Dorothea recognised her mother's handwriting with a sinking feeling. Lady Ashmore didn't write urgent letters unless something had gone catastrophically wrong or she wanted something badly enough to pretend catastrophe. She broke the seal with fingers that wanted to tremble and read in silence while Edmund pretended to study his maps but was clearly watching her face. Dearest Dorothea, I write with news of a most distressing nature. Your sister finds herself in desperate circumstances. Lord Pemberton's father has refused to acknowledge their marriage, performed in haste, I'm afraid, without proper settlements or family approval. The scandal has been tremendous. Vivienne has returned to Hartwell House in disgrace, and I fear her prospects are quite ruined. Your father and I have discussed the matter at length. Given that your own marriage contract has not yet been finalised, we believe it would be both generous and appropriate for Vivienne to take her rightful place as the Duke's bride. Her beauty and accomplishments would reflect more favourably on the family name, and you could return home without the burden of a position you were never truly suited for. We are sending Vivienne north immediately. She should arrive at Ravenscroft within 3 days. I trust you will facilitate this transition with your customary good sense and dignity. Your loving mother Dorothea read it twice, the words not quite penetrating the first time. When understanding finally came, it arrived with the force of physical blow. They wanted her to step aside, to give up Edmund, Ravenscroft, the future she'd just begun to imagine, because Vivienne's romantic gamble had failed and she needed rescuing. And they assumed, of course they assumed, that practical, sensible Dorothea would do it without complaint and would sacrifice herself because that's what she'd always done. What is it? Edmund's voice cut through her spiralling thoughts. She handed him the letter without speaking, unable to trust her voice, watched his face as he read, saw his expression shift from curiosity to disbelief to cold fury. They cannot be serious. He set the letter down with controlled force. They expect you to simply withdraw, return home as though the last 2 weeks meant nothing. They think I should be grateful, Dorothea said, and was surprised to hear her voice come out steady. Grateful to escape a position I was never suited for. Grateful to let my beautiful, accomplished sister have what she deserves. And what do you think? The question stopped her. What did she think? For 23 years, she'd been trained to consider everyone's needs before her own, to value duty over desire, to accept what was decided for her with grace. But the last 2 weeks had changed something fundamental. Edmund had asked her opinions and actually listened to the answers, had treated her intelligence as an asset rather than an aberration, had looked at her as though she mattered, not despite being the plain, sensible sister, but because of who she actually was. For the first time in her life, Dorothea had felt seen, valued, wanted, and now they expected her to give that up, because Vivienne's prettier face would reflect better on the family name. "I think," she said slowly, feeling her way through honesty that still felt dangerous, "that I'm angry, which makes me ashamed, because I should want my sister's happiness." "Your sister's happiness cost her a marriage and a reputation. Now she wants yours to repair the damage." Edmund's voice was hard. "That's not sisterly love, Dorothea. That's selfishness dressed as necessity. She's desperate, so she should impose on your desperation. You think you weren't desperate when you arrived here? Sent as a replacement, expecting disappointment, prepared to endure a life of being second choice." He moved closer, his intensity making her breath catch. "I'm not returning you like faulty merchandise because your family decided they'd prefer to send the other model. You can't refuse them. They're my family, and you're about to be my wife. That makes you my family, mine to protect, including from people who've spent your whole life teaching you that you matter less than they." The fierce possessiveness in his voice should have frightened her. Instead, it made something warm unfold in her chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. "What do we do?" she asked. "We marry. Now. Before your sister arrives, and your family can pressure you into sacrificing yourself again." He was already moving toward the door. "I'll send it to the vicar. We can be married by special license tomorrow if I push hard enough." "Edmund, wait." Dorothea caught his arm, feeling the muscle tense beneath her fingers. "If we marry in haste, everyone will say I trapped you, that I manipulated the situation to secure a position I don't deserve. I don't care what everyone says, but I do. I care that people will look at me and see someone who stole her sister's place through cunning rather than whatever this is between us." He turned to face her fully, his hands coming up to frame her face with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the anger still burning in his eyes. "What this is between us is real. It's based on genuine compatibility and mutual respect. And the fact that I find myself thinking about you constantly, your observations, your questions, the way you furrow your brow when you're concentrating on ledgers. What this is me wanting to spend my life with someone who challenges me intellectually and makes me laugh and doesn't pretend to be anything other than exactly who she is. But no, listen to me, Dorothea. I lost one wife to circumstances beyond my control. I watched Caroline die and couldn't do anything to save her. But this, your family trying to take you away, that I can fight, that I will fight. The question is whether you want me to, or whether some part of you believes they're right, that you don't deserve this life." The question cut to the bone of every insecurity she'd ever carried. Did she deserve Edmund? Did she deserve Ravenscroft, partnership, the possibility of love? Or was she fooling herself, grasping at something meant for women like Vivienne? But then she thought about the last 2 weeks. The conversations that had stretched for hours, the way Edmund looked at her when she made an unexpected observation about estate management, the morning he'd handed her the account books and said, "Tell me what you see," with genuine interest in her answer. He hadn't treated her like a replacement or a consolation prize. He'd treated her like an equal, like someone whose presence added value to his life rather than merely filling an empty space. "I want to stay," she said quietly. "I want this. You, us, whatever we're building here. Then that's what matters, not your mother's letters or your sister's failed marriage or society's opinion about which daughter deserves which husband." He lowered his hands but didn't step away. "When Vivienne arrives, we'll be united in our decision. Together." "Agreed." Dorothea nodded, feeling something settle in her chest. Not peace, exactly, but determination. She had spent her life being practical, being sensible, being the daughter who did what needed doing without complaint. Maybe it was time to be impractical, to choose what she wanted instead of accepting what was assigned to her. "Agreed," she said. They were married the next day in Ravenscroft's private chapel, a small stone building that had witnessed 3 centuries of Blackwood ceremonies. No grand celebration, no society guests, just Edmund and Dorothea, the vicar, and Mrs. Warren and the butler as witnesses. Dorothea wore a simple dress of cream silk that the housekeeper had somehow procured overnight. Edmund wore his usual dark coat, though he'd added a waistcoat of blue brocade that matched her eyes, a detail she noticed with a surge of affection that took her breath. The ceremony itself was brief, traditional words spoken with weight that came from meaning rather than ritual. When Edmund slipped the ring onto her finger, a band of gold set with small diamonds that had belonged to his grandmother, his hand was steady even though hers trembled. "I, Edmund, take thee, Dorothea." His voice resonated in the small space, clear and certain. When it was her turn, she looked up at him and saw not a duke or an obligation, but a man who had chosen her deliberately, knowing exactly who she was. "I, Dorothea, take thee, Edmund." And she meant it, every word, in ways she hadn't known were possible when she'd left Somerset 2 weeks ago. They were walking back to the main house, newly married, when the sound of carriage wheels on gravel announced an arrival neither of them wanted, but both had expected. Vivienne had come. Vivienne Ashmore descended from the carriage like a queen returning from exile. Blonde hair perfectly arranged despite the long journey. Blue eyes bright with the confidence of someone who'd never been denied anything she truly wanted. She wore a travelling dress of rose silk that must have cost more than Dorothea's entire wardrobe, and she carried herself with the particular grace that came from knowing she was beautiful and expecting the world to arrange itself accordingly. She stopped when she saw them standing together on the steps. Her gaze swept over Dorothea's cream silk dress, lingered on Edmund's formal attire, and comprehension dawned with visible shock. "You're married." It wasn't a question. Vivienne's voice carried across the courtyard with the clarity of accusation. "Mother's letter said you'd understand, that you'd do the right thing." "I did do the right thing," Dorothea said, and was startled by the steadiness of her own voice. "I married the man I was sent here to marry. But I'm here now. The arrangement was meant for me. Everyone knows that." Vivienne moved closer, ascending the steps with the assumption that proximity would grant her control of the situation. "Dorothea, surely you see that this is for the best. You're not suited to be a duchess. You never were. Let me take my rightful place, and you can return home without shame." "Her rightful place is beside me," Edmund interrupted, his voice carrying the particular authority of someone who had just sworn sacred vows and meant them. "As my wife, as the Duchess of Ravenscroft, there is no other arrangement to be made." Vivienne's beautiful face twisted with something ugly, desperation mixed with disbelief. "But I'm the one you were supposed to marry. I'm the one who was chosen." "You were not chosen," Edmund said flatly. "Your father offered an alliance, and I accepted it. When circumstances changed, I accepted Dorothea instead. At no point did anyone ask my preference regarding which daughter I'd prefer. If they had, the answer would have been Dorothea from the beginning." The words landed like blows. Dorothea saw her sister flinch, saw the calculation in Vivienne's eyes as she tried to understand how this had gone so catastrophically wrong. "You can't mean that. Look at her." Vivienne gestured at Dorothea with barely concealed contempt. "Plain, unfashionable, too serious by half. What could you possibly want with someone like that when you could have—" "Someone who thinks being beautiful excuses being cruel." Edmund's voice had gone cold. "Someone who abandoned a marriage contract the moment something more appealing appeared, then came running back when her romantic gamble failed. Someone who assumes her sister should sacrifice her own happiness to repair the mess she made." Vivienne's face flushed red. "How dare you speak to me that way? I speak to you as the husband of the woman you're insulting in her own home. And I speak as someone who knows exactly what kind of wife you would have made. Decorative, demanding, and utterly disinterested in anything beyond your own comfort. That's not fair, isn't it? Tell me, Miss Ashmore, in the 2 weeks you were engaged to Lord Pemberton, did you ever once consider how your choice would affect your sister? Did it occur to you that Dorothea might have feelings, preferences, a life that mattered beyond its utility to—" Vivienne's mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. Dorothea watched her sister struggle with a question she'd clearly never asked herself, and felt a strange mixture of pity and anger. "I didn't think—" Vivienne started, then stopped. "No," Dorothea said quietly. "You didn't. You never do. You feel things intensely and act on those feelings, and everyone else is expected to manage the consequences. That's not true. It is true. When you wanted drawing lessons, I gave up my music instruction because father couldn't afford both. When you needed a new dress for your debut, I wore mother's altered gown because there wasn't money for two. When you fell in love with Lord Pemberton and needed someone to fulfill your marriage contract, I was sent north to fix your mistake. Dorothea's voice remained calm, but something was breaking open inside her. Years of accommodation and self-effacement finally finding words. I've spent my entire life making myself smaller so you could shine brighter, and I'm done. Dorothea, please. Vivienne's voice cracked, genuine distress finally breaking through her pretty facade. I have nowhere else to go. Pemberton's family won't acknowledge me. I'm ruined. If I can't marry the Duke, you'll end up facing the consequences of your own choices, Edmund said, not unkindly, but with finality, which is something you should have learned long before now. Your sister is not responsible for rescuing you from situations you created. But what am I supposed to do? Vivienne looked genuinely lost now, stripped of her beauty's usual power to smooth her path. Go home, Dorothea said. Tell mother and father that the Duke and I are married and the arrangement is complete. Tell them. She paused, searching for words that were honest without being unnecessarily cruel. Tell them I'm happy, which is more than I expected, and more than they gave me reason to hope for. Vivienne stood frozen on the steps, seeming to finally understand that tears and beauty and accusations wouldn't change what had already been decided. When she spoke again, her voice was small, uncertain, a tone Dorothea had never heard from her confident golden sister. Do you really love him? Or are you just doing this to spite me? The question was so absurd, so completely inverted from reality, that Dorothea almost laughed. Spite you? Vivienne, you've had everything your entire life. Every pretty dress, every admiring glance, every bit of father's pride and mother's attention. The idea that I would marry a man I've come to care for deeply just to spite you is... She stopped, shaking her head. I'm not doing this to you. I'm doing this for myself. For the first time in my life, I'm choosing what I want instead of accepting what everyone else decides I should settle for. Vivienne looked between Dorothea and Edmund, seeing perhaps for the first time the way he stood slightly protective of his wife, the way Dorothea's hand had found his without apparent thought, the comfortable unity of two people who had genuinely chosen each other. You really do care for her, Vivienne said to Edmund, wonder in her voice. This isn't just, you actually want her. I want her, Edmund confirmed. I chose her. I married her. And I will not unmake those choices to accommodate your convenience or your family's preference for your prettier face. The blunt words made Vivienne flinch, but she nodded slowly, acceptance finally settling over her features. I suppose I should go then. I suppose you should, Dorothea agreed. But as Vivienne turned back toward the carriage, Dorothea felt an unexpected surge of something that might have been pity, or might have been the last echo of sisterly affection. Vivienne. Her sister turned, hope flaring in her beautiful eyes. I'm sorry your marriage to Lord Pemberton didn't work out the way you hoped. I'm sorry you're facing social consequences that feel unfair. But I'm not sorry I'm staying here, and I won't apologize for being happy. Vivienne nodded again, this time with something that might have been understanding. You're braver than I thought. I always assumed you just accepted things, that you didn't want more than what you were given. I learned to want carefully, Dorothea said, because wanting things that seemed impossible only brought disappointment. But Edmund taught me that sometimes the impossible things are exactly what you should reach for. After Vivienne's carriage disappeared down the tree-lined drive, Dorothea and Edmund stood together on the steps in the fading afternoon light. The confrontation had left her shaking with reaction, anger and relief, and the strange, weightless feeling that came from finally standing up for herself. Are you all right? Edmund asked, his hand warm against the small of her back. I don't know. I feel... She struggled to articulate the tumult of emotions. Free, terrified, guilty for not feeling more guilty. She laughed, the sound slightly unsteady. Is that mad? No, it's honest. He turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. You spent your life being told that your sister's happiness mattered more than yours. Breaking free of that would be difficult, even if she hadn't arrived demanding you sacrifice yourself again. What you did took courage. I didn't feel courageous. I felt angry. Courage often starts with anger. with deciding that what's being asked of you is wrong, even if everyone else insists it's right. His thumb traced along her jaw, a gesture so tender it made her throat tight. I'm proud of you. The simple statement undid something in Dorothea's chest. When had anyone ever said they were proud of her? Certainly not her parents, who valued compliance over conviction. Not her sister, who barely noticed Dorothea existed except when she needed something. But Edmund had known. He valued what he saw, had married her, not despite who she was, but because of it. I should probably write to my parents, she said. Explain what happened. Later. Right now, I think my wife deserves to celebrate her wedding day without worrying about how to manage other people's disappointment. My wife. The words still sounded impossible, wonderful, like something from a story that happened to other women. What did you have in mind? She asked. Dinner. Dancing, if you're amenable. The music room has excellent acoustics, and I'm told I'm tolerably competent at the waltz. And then, his smile turned slightly wicked, we have a wedding night to attend to, and I'm very interested in discovering whether my wife blushes as beautifully in private as she does in public. Dorothea felt heat flood her cheeks, proving his point. I don't know. Neither do I. Not with you. His voice softened. We'll learn together, like everything else. The evening unfolded with a dreamlike quality. Dinner was an intimate affair, just the two of them at one end of the long table, talking and laughing over wine that loosened Dorothea's carefully maintained composure. Afterward, Edmund led her to the music room, where someone had lit dozens of candles, transforming the space into something almost magical. I'm not accomplished at dancing, Dorothea warned, as he pulled her into a waltz position. Good, neither am I. We'll be incompetent together. They were, in fact, both adequate dancers. But the pleasure wasn't in the steps. It was in the proximity, in the excuse to touch, in the way Edmund's hand felt warm and sure against her back. They waltzed slowly around the room, the candles casting their shadows large against the walls, and Dorothea let herself feel young and cherished and wanted. When the imaginary music ended, they stood close together, neither quite willing to break the contact. Dorothea, Edmund said quietly, I need you to understand something. Today, when Vivienne arrived, I would have sent her away regardless of what you wanted. Not because I'm high-handed, but because the thought of losing you to your family's selfishness was unbearable. Edmund, let me finish. I married you quickly, yes, partly to prevent your family from pressuring you into stepping aside, but also because I was certain. I've been certain since the 4th day you were here, when you argued with my steward about crop rotation and won the argument through sheer logic and passion. I've been certain since you asked me why I let the tenant children use the East Meadow for their games when it could be profitable grazing land, and looked genuinely pleased when I said their childhood mattered more than marginal profit. I've been certain since the morning you laughed at something I said and then looked surprised, as if you'd forgotten that joy was allowed. Dorothea's vision blurred with tears she hadn't meant to shed. I didn't think I was allowed to want this, to want you. Want me, he said fiercely. Want this life, this partnership, everything we're building. You're allowed to want things, Dorothea, especially things that make you happy. She kissed him then, rising on her toes to press her lips to his with more enthusiasm than skill. He made a surprised sound, then pulled her closer, teaching her through patient demonstration how a kiss could be slow and deep and consuming. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Edmund rested his forehead against hers. I think, he said, his voice rough with desire and affection, that we should continue this conversation somewhere more private. I think, Dorothea agreed. That's an excellent idea. He led her up the grand staircase and down the corridor to the ducal suite, rooms she'd slept in alone for 2 weeks, but would share from this night forward. Inside, candles had been lit, the bed turned down, everything prepared for a wedding night she'd half convinced herself would never truly happen. Edmund closed the door behind them, sealing them away from duty and expectation, and everything except each other. When he looked at her, Dorothea saw not obligation or resignation, but genuine want. Are you frightened? He asked. A little, she admitted, but not of you, just of not knowing what to expect. Then I'll tell you exactly what to expect. He moved closer, his hands framing her face with impossible gentleness. Patience, attention to what pleases you. No shame about ignorance, because I'm equally ignorant about what you need. and the absolute certainty that if something doesn't feel right, we stop. Agreed? Agreed. What followed was tender and awkward, and occasionally fumbling. Two people learning each other's bodies with care and humour, and growing confident. Edmund was patient when she tensed, attentive to signals she didn't know she was sending, quick to reassure when uncertainty made her hesitate. And when the awkwardness finally gave way to pleasure, when Dorothea discovered that wanting and being wanted could exist in the same moment, she understood that this intimacy built on trust and genuine affection was what she'd been afraid to hope for. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the massive bed, Dorothea's head on Edmund's chest, listening to his heartbeat slow. His fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder, and she felt more at peace than she ever had in her life. "I love you," she said quietly, testing the words for the first time. "I know it's soon, and maybe I shouldn't say it yet, but I love you too," Edmund interrupted, tilting her face up so he could see her eyes. "I have for days, possibly since you told my steward he was wrong about the drainage system, and then proved it with math." Dorothea laughed, the sound muffled against his chest. "That's a very specific moment to fall in love. You were very convincing. Also, you had ink on your nose from the calculations, and I found it devastatingly charming." They fell asleep that way, wrapped in each other and in the certainty that what they'd chosen was right, even if the world might never understand how the plain sister and the grieving Duke had found something that felt like grace. The first snow of winter was falling when Dorothea walked through Ravenscroft's portrait gallery, her hand resting unconsciously on the swell of her belly. 6 months along, the physician had said, and everything was progressing beautifully. She paused before the newest addition to the gallery, a portrait commissioned by Edmund as a wedding anniversary. In the painting, she sat in the estate office, account books spread before her, sunlight streaming through the window behind her. The artist had captured something Edmund claimed to see, but that Dorothea still struggled to recognize in herself: confidence, intelligence, the quiet authority of someone who belonged exactly where she was. "Admiring yourself?" Edmund's voice came from the doorway, warm with affection and gentle tease. "Admiring the artist's flattery," Dorothea corrected, turning to face her husband. He looked slightly windblown from his morning ride, colour high in his cheeks from cold air and exercise. "I don't actually look that self-assured." "You do. You simply don't notice it because you're too busy being self-assured to observe yourself doing it." He crossed to her, his hand joining hers on her belly. "How are you feeling?" "Enormous. Ungainly. Like I've swallowed a very active melon." "You're radiant, though I'll grant you the melon is quite energetic." He felt the baby kick beneath their joined hands and smiled with wonder that hadn't diminished despite months of feeling their child move. "Strong, like her mother. We don't know if it's a girl." "I know. The same way I knew I'd marry you the 4th day you were here, arguing about crop rotation with mathematical proofs." Dorothea leaned against him, letting him take some of her weight in the way he'd insisted on doing, since her belly had begun to truly show. "I had a letter from Vivienne this morning." She felt Edmund tense slightly. Relations with Dorothea's family had remained complicated, not hostile, but strained by the memory of how they'd treated her and what they'd expected her to sacrifice. "And," he asked carefully, "she's engaged to a vicar in Hampshire, a younger son of the family, genuinely kind, apparently quite content to marry a woman with a tarnished reputation, because he cares more about her heart than her history." Dorothea paused, processing her own feelings about the news. "She sounds happy. Actually happy, not just making the best of things. Are you pleased for her?" "I think I am. It's easier to forgive someone who's found their own happiness, rather than still demanding you sacrifice yours for them." She looked up at Edmund. "She asked if we might visit. After the baby comes. She wants to introduce her intended and see Ravenscroft, and possibly acknowledge that she behaved abominably. Do you want to see her?" It was the question he always asked when anything involved her family. Not what was proper or expected, but what she wanted. A year of marriage hadn't made her entirely comfortable with being asked her preferences, but she was learning. "I think I do." Not to reconcile as though nothing happened, but to acknowledge we're both different people than we were, that we've both chosen paths that actually suit us. "Then we'll invite them in the spring, when travelling will be easier, and you'll be recovered from childbirth and able to show off our perfect child." He said it so matter-of-factly that Dorothea laughed. You're very confident this child will be perfect. With you as a mother, inevitable, intelligent, honest, brave enough to ask difficult questions. Those are your favorite things about me. The baby might take after you. God help us all if we produce a child with my stubbornness and your mathematical ability. The estate steward will resign in protest. They walked together through the gallery, past portraits of generations of Blackwoods who had lived and loved and raised families in these rooms. Dorothea had spent the last year learning the history of each face, understanding the weight of legacy and the privilege of adding to it. I've been thinking, Edmund said as they reached the portrait of his first wife, Caroline, a gentle, pretty woman captured in a garden with flowers in her hands. This should move to the family wing, not hidden, but not here in the formal gallery where we entertain. She deserves to be remembered by those who loved her, not displayed as an obligation. It was a generous thought, acknowledging Caroline's importance while making room for their marriage to exist without constantly referencing what came before. That's kind, Dorothea said quietly. It's honest. Caroline was my past, and I loved her truly. You're my present and future, and I love you differently, but no less truly. Both things can be real without diminishing each other. They continued down the corridor toward the main staircase, passing the music room where they danced on their wedding night, the library where they still spent evenings in companionable reading, the estate office where Dorothea had proven herself as capable a manager as Edmund had predicted. Mrs. Warren met them at the base of the stairs with the particular expression that meant household matters required the Duchess's attention. Dorothea had stopped feeling like an imposter in that role somewhere around the 3rd month of marriage, when she'd successfully negotiated new contracts with the village merchants, and the head cook had declared her a proper duchess who understands value. Your Grace, the committee for the tenant school is here for your meeting about the curriculum expansion, and the seamstress has arrived with fabric samples for the nursery curtains. And Lord Pemberton has sent a note asking permission to call next week, something about water rights and shared boundaries. Dorothea absorbed the information with the practiced efficiency she'd developed over 12 months of actually managing a ducal household. Tell the school committee I'll join them in 20 minutes. Ask the seamstress to set up in the morning room. I'll review the samples after lunch. And Edmund, didn't you want to discuss the water rights question with Pemberton directly? I did. Yes. Tell him Tuesday afternoon would suit. Edmund waited until Mrs. Warren had departed before turning to Dorothea with obvious admiration. You realize you've become rather formidable. I had an excellent teacher in how to manage estates and duck obligations I don't want. You've surpassed the teacher. The tenant school expansion was entirely your idea, and it's going to change opportunities for the next generation in ways I never considered. The meeting with the school committee went as such meetings usually did. Dorothea presented her research on curriculum models from progressive schools, answered questions about costs and logistics, and ultimately convinced the committee that teaching girls mathematics and science alongside traditional subjects would benefit the entire community. By the time the committee departed, agreements had been reached and implementation timelines established. She was reviewing fabric samples with the seamstress, soft blues and greens that would make the nursery feel peaceful rather than overwhelming, when Edmund found her again. The vicar stopped by while you were in your meeting, wanted to discuss the Christmas services and mentioned something about a family from the village in difficult circumstances. He paused. I told him you'd handle it. Was that presumptuous? No, it's what I do. And it was. Somewhere in the last year, Dorothea had become the person people came to with problems that needed both practical solutions and genuine compassion. The transformation from overlooked second daughter to Duchess, who mattered, had been so gradual, she'd barely noticed it happening. That evening, after dinner and estate work, and the 100 small decisions that filled their days, Dorothea and Edmund retreated to their private sitting room. He settled into his preferred chair, with parliamentary papers he needed to review. She curled up on the settee with correspondence that required answers, but she kept looking up from her letters to watch him, the way he frowned slightly when concentrating, the habit he had of running his hand through his hair when frustrated with political manoeuvring, the occasional smile when he read something that pleased him. What? He asked, catching her watching. Nothing. Everything. I'm just grateful. For what specifically? The excellent estate management, the impending arrival of our mathematically gifted child, my devastating charm, for choosing me, for seeing something in the plain, serious sister that no one else saw. for making me believe I deserved to be chosen." Edmund set aside his papers and crossed to the settee, sitting beside her and pulling her close despite the awkward angle created by her pregnant belly. "You've got it backward, love. You made me believe I deserved to be chosen. After Caroline died, I convinced myself that duty was enough, that managing estates and sitting in Parliament and fulfilling obligations was sufficient purpose. And then you arrived with your questions about crop rotation and your refusal to pretend you were anything other than exactly who you are. And you reminded me that partnership could be more than transaction, that marriage could be collaboration instead of obligation. We were both a bit lost, weren't we? You in grief, me in invisibility. And now we're found, together, building something that matters, not just heirs and lineage, but genuine partnership, raising a child who will learn that intelligence matters more than beauty, that questions are more valuable than compliance, that being chosen means being seen for exactly who you are." Dorothea felt the baby move again, a strong kick that made Edmund laugh with delight. "She agrees," he said, or he. "Either way, our child has opinions. Takes after both parents then." They sat together as the fire burned low and the December wind rattled the windows, and the world beyond Ravenscroft carried on without needing their attention. This was what Dorothea had learned in 12 months of marriage, that happiness wasn't the dramatic moments or the grand gestures, but these quiet evenings, the shared work, the comfortable silence, the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. A year ago, she'd arrived at Ravenscroft expecting to be tolerated, prepared to endure a life of being second choice to the sister who'd refused to come. Instead, she'd found partnership, genuine affection, and the revolutionary discovery that being chosen deliberately was worth more than all the beauty and accomplishments in the... She'd been sent in her sister's place for an arranged marriage. The Duke had taken one look, not at her face or her fashion, or any of the superficial things that usually mattered, but at who she actually was beneath the dismissals and low expectations, and he'd chosen her forever, not because she was available or convenient or the only option remaining, but because, improbably and wonderfully, she was exactly what he wanted.